Hello and welcome everyone to this video podcast for human genetics. In this podcast, we're going to focus on multifactorial traits. Over the past, say, 15 to 20 years, maybe longer, but about that, we've started to understand the genomes of organisms with greater precision and accuracy. We've started to understand genes in humans and how they're linked to various diseases or other traits. And your chapter opens up with an interesting story, I think, so I thought I would open up as well. You can go online and you can find various tests to test your genome for various traits or even some diseases. But there are some tests called sports genetics tests, and I won't tell you any of their names because I'm not trying to advertise for them. A consumer could buy this test. They could test their genome to determine if they had any predicted athletic trait. They could even give it to their child to determine if their child had any potential athletic ability. One could even take it a step further and imagine that a couple could test a series of embryos that they were going to implant to see which one they might want to pick based upon its ability to play sports. I want to stress, I am not endorsing this. I'm just presenting to you a possible future. This opening story talks about this gene called actin, more specifically actin 3. We have several actin genes in our body, and they're a part of the cytoskeleton, and this particular one has been shown to play a role in muscle performance. So if you remember, earlier in the semester, I explained to you how we have these chromosomes, and then on these chromosomes you could have genes. And in a population, I'm just going to draw them like so. Maybe you have these three genes in a population. One, they're all for actin, but they're different genetic variants, meaning that the sequence of this gene, let me just draw it as a box. It might be a little easier to see what I'm trying to point out here. It could be that this one has a mutation here, and this one has a mutation here in the sequence. Now remember, not all mutations are bad. And in this case, what we have here are examples of what some might argue is a positive trait. This mutation is found more predominantly in high-performance sprinters, say world Olympic athletes. And this one here is found in highly competitive endurance runners, like those who run marathons. And this is just a regular old actin one that does its job. People with that one are perfectly fine. It is most undoubtedly the one that's found in me. I'm pretty sure I don't have either one of these, or maybe I do, and it's just not expressed. So that leads to this question here. How accurate are these tests? If you sequenced your genome and you found out you had this variant, does that mean you are a good sprinter? And if you had this variant, would you sign up for a marathon tomorrow? Or if you had this one, would you give up hope of ever being an athlete? In thinking about multifactorial traits here, it's important to remember that traits, such as athleticism, are not strictly determined by one's genes. There are other factors that are involved. There are other genes involved. There are various genetic rules you should know before you make such predictions. I think you should be able to come up with 3 ways that these tests are not as accurate as the designers would want the general public to believe. Another question you might consider, would you test your kids? If you did test your kid, would that influence any decisions regarding your child? So we're going to move on, and we may come back to this question a little bit later, or maybe you'll see it in class in a different format. As we move through multifactorial traits, you may think back to this question here. What would you do in this situation? Would you get this test? Would you not get this test? And so forth. I changed our title here because I wanted to make sure we added polygenic traits, as that's going to be an important thing for us to consider. On the previous board, we asked the question, would you want to be tested? Another way to look at this question is, let's think about some people who are talented in their chosen professions. So you may think of a famous musician. When I was a kid, one of my favorite guitarists was Eddie Van Halen. And then he married Valerie Bertinelli, who was an accomplished actress. So in that case, would you expect those two individuals to have children with musical abilities? You might think about an athlete. You might think of someone like LeBron James. will their kids be athletes? There's some evidence, at least in LeBron James' case, that his son does appear to be a pretty good basketball player. But is it due to the genes that LeBron James and the mother provided the child? Or was it something else? Or was it a combination of factors? Maybe someone who is a scientist. Lynn Margulis, she was a famous scientist. She's the one that proposed the endosymbiotic theory explaining the evolution of mitochondria. And then she married and had kids with Carl Sagan, who is a famous astronomer. Will their children be scientists? So are the abilities of the parents passed on to the kids because of the genes they pass on? So this is the question I guess we want to ask here. Is it genes or the environment? Or is it both? Now the answer is, in most cases, it's both. There are a few traits that we can clearly link just to genetics, very few though. And then there are some traits that we can link more strongly to the environment. But most often these traits combine both of these factors, which makes making these predictions about parents and their children to be more difficult. Not impossible, but a little bit more difficult. So I want to spend some time giving a more of a formal definition of these two terms. Polygenic. Now this term refers to traits caused by more than one gene. For instance, let's just say that for the trait of being a good musician, there are 3 really important genes involved. Maybe more, but let's just say there are these 3. In fact, I'm certain there's more. And just for simplicity, we'll call this gene 1, this gene 2, and this gene 3. And maybe gene 1 has a variation of it, an allele of it, that is found in musicians. Maybe Eddie Van Halen has that mutation in him. In this other gene, gene 2, maybe there's an allele form that has also been linked to musicians. And let's pretend that I had a daughter who we had her genome sequenced, and we discovered that she had these 2 alleles. And we might be excited because, hey, this means she's going to be a musician and be a famous guitarist for a heavy metal band. And so we have that anticipation for her. But what we did not know in this story I'm telling you is that gene 3 here is mutated in such a way that it doesn't work. And maybe this gene, its role is regulating 1 and 2. So it makes a protein that comes back here and produces the protein from gene 2 and comes over here and produces the protein of gene 1. This is a polygenic trait that you need all 3 of these genes for, in this case, the complex trait of being a musician. All 3 genes are important. Now maybe my child will go on and become a musician, who knows? But it's not specifically because of these 2 genes. It's because of other genetic factors or environmental effects. I bought her music lessons, perhaps. Now we also know that, as I just alluded to, being a famous musician, or being a musician at all, isn't just a matter of the genes. We know genes play a role in it, but it's not the only reason. Because we know complex traits, like being a musician, are multifactorial. And so these are traits caused by a gene or many genes. So multifactorial traits can also be polygenic. So we'll say by a gene or genes plus environmental contributions. For instance, if you have children that have the alleles for gene 1, gene 2, and gene 3 that would predict that they would be a musician, that alone isn't going to make them a musician. There's other things that are involved. You got to take lessons, and apparently when you take lessons you also have to practice. It takes hard work, persistence, right? All of these things that are important. Maybe you also have to have good hearing. In fact, I suspect that does help. I am not musically inclined, but I would think that would be important. Now, polygenic traits here. I want to say one quick thing here. Very few traits that are purely polygenic. There can be polygenic traits, but most often they are also multifactorial. One of the few that is pretty close to being a purely polygenic trait is the trait of eye color. There are some environmental factors that have been linked to it, but not many. And for the most part, you can predict somebody's eye color by looking at their genetics. Unless they put on colored contact lenses, then that throws everything off in your predictions. Now let's give some examples of multifactorial. I could probably spend the next 30 minutes just listing multifactorial traits, but I won't. But I would like to list a few of them. Cancer, and we'll spend some more time talking about cancer later in the semester, but that is clearly a multifactorial trait where genes and the environment are important. Diabetes, particularly diabetes type 2, has many environmental links and a genetic link. And the last one I want to say is heart disease. Heart disease certainly runs in families, but there's a huge environmental component. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about heart disease as a multifactorial trait. Your book lists uncontrollable factors and controllable factors. Some of the uncontrollable factors are the genes you're born with. So let's begin with those. These could be genes important in metabolizing lipids, genes that are important in blood clotting, inflammation genes, a whole series of genes. But then also your age and what sex you are. We know that males are much more likely to have heart disease than females. Things that you can control, however, is your diet. We know a diet that has lots of fats in it is a contributing factor to heart disease. High blood pressure. Now, high blood pressure itself is a multifactorial disease as well, but the parts of it that you can control, such as the amount of exercise, your diet, how much salt you're taking in, all are contributing factors. Smoking is a contributing factor for many diseases. Cholesterol, but I would also lump that in with diet there. Stress, we know high stress leads to heart disease quicker. And diabetes is also a contributing factor to heart disease. Diabetes is also, as I state over here, a multifactorial trait. So there's only so much you can do to control whether or not you're going to get diabetes. What I'd like to talk about now are continuous traits, which tend to be more common than discontinuous traits. Now, earlier in the semester, when we were talking about Mendel, we talked about Mendel's peas. And he looked at several traits, but one trait he looked at was the height of the pea plant. And I'm just going to draw it like this versus this. As he characterized them, he said they were either tall or short. I think it would be hard to believe that all the tall plants were of this height and all the short plants were this height. There were probably some variations here, probably some that were like this, and some that were maybe even taller. Those he characterized as short. There were some that were shorter, and there were some that were a little taller. But he could still lump them into this broad category of tall versus short. But when we think about a natural occurring population, we would assume that the pea plants would have a distribution of heights, something like that. And so we would call this a continuous trait. If it was just one tall and one short, that very qualitative trait, we would say that was discontinuous. But for the most part, we're going to talk about continuous traits in human genetics. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at this picture here. This picture is of a group of students that were lined up based upon their heights, all the way from 5'3" to 6'5". And you can see in this particular picture, most of the students were 5.5. That is 5 feet, 5 inches. And there's a nice random distribution. Now, the reason we don't see all people that are saying that 5'3", 5'4" range, and then the other side is 6.4, 6.5, is because there is a lot of variability within any given population. There are factors such as hormones, diet, education, the relative nutrition in certain areas of the world, male or female. Males tend to be a little taller than females. I am, of course, an exception to that rule. And we know that the environment can play a little bit of a role in this, because if we took a picture like this 50 years ago, in fact, there are pictures like this from 50 years ago, we see that the average height from the same region of the country to be a little lower. Now, that's because things have changed. We understand diet a little bit better. There's been more people moving in and out of the area, so you've had an influx of new genes, for instance. So, when we think of continuous traits, certainly height is one of those. Fingerprint patterns is another. Hair, eye, and skin color are also continuous traits. All of these are polygenic, more than one gene involved, plus they are also multifactorial. I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about the continuous trait of skin color. We know there are many genes involved, so clearly a polygenic trait. We know there are some environmental factors. If you go out and tan, your skin can change colors. It can get a little darker. And in some people, it can get a lot darker. So many genes as well as an environmental influence. And these various factors here help account for why we see so many different colors, so many different hues of a person's skin color. So I would like to introduce a few terms to you to help us understand the genetic contribution to skin color. And then I'm going to end with why the term race is really not a term that we in biology and in genetics would use. So I'm going to draw two sides here. On this side, I'm going to show the pathway for someone with darker pigmentation. And over here, I want to show the pathway for lighter pigmentation. We know that where we see the darker or lighter pigmentation is at the surface of our skin. So let's just draw some skin cells at the surface of each of these examples. And we know individuals with darker pigmentation will have more melanin in these cells. Compared to someone with lighter pigmentation, they're going to have less melanin in their skin cells that we see on the surface. And so let's define melanin. This is a dark pigment. This is a dark pigment that protects against UV damage. But how do we get this darker pigment up here? So I want to introduce this cell here to you called the melanocyte. And the melanocyte has these like fairly elaborate extensions to the cell. So let's write melanocyte here. These are melanocytes. These are the cells that make melanin. Now how much they make, that will determine the overall hue of someone's skin. Regardless of the color of someone's skin, everybody has about the same number of melanocytes, these cells that make melanin. Now everybody has different amounts of melanin though. These melanocytes are going to have a nucleus, and the genes in the nucleus will code for melanin. There's not more genes for melanin in people with darker skin pigmentation compared to lighter skin pigmentation. They just make more of it. And so they will produce more of this melanin. But we can't see this in a person. We can only see this outer layer. How does it get from here to here? Well, there is this other layer of cells called keratinocytes. These are, for all practical purposes in this class, just your skin cells. These cells up here are also keratinocytes. What happens is that this melanin will get transferred into keratinocytes near the melanocyte. Now more will get transferred into someone with darker skin pigmentation than someone with lighter skin pigmentation, just because there's more melanin there. So how does this get up here? I guess you could imagine a way it would transfer it all the way up. But to explain what happens here, I'm going to erase these words down here. If you remember, we have these adult stem cells, or as I prefer, somatic stem cells. They're very important in skin because as these skins fall off, because that's what our skin does, it has to be replaced by new skin cells or new keratinocytes. And so they will divide, and when they divide, they will produce these specialized keratinocytes. All individuals will do this, regardless of the pigmentation in their skin. And then what happens is, as more are being produced, cells get pushed up. These divide, they make more cells, and the next layer of cells moves up one. And they keep moving up one division at a time. So as these cells divide, make new ones, these cells that have pigment in them will then move up. And at some point, these cells here, if we had a time-lapse camera, they would slowly reach the top of our skin. And then these cells at some point would just die and they would be removed. There's one more term I want to throw at you here, and it's an enzyme called tyrosinase. And its job is to activate the melanin pathway. Individuals who have darker skin pigmentation are going to have a very active tyrosinase. People with lighter skin pigmentation, their tyrosinase will either be mutated or it will be inhibited. This one simple enzyme helps control, to a very large extent, the degree of pigmentation we see in all of our fellow human beings. We tend to make a big deal about that slight difference, but that's all it is. One enzyme. Now, I say one enzyme, but I also want you to be aware that there are many other genes involved in it, but this is a major player in it. So now let's consider skin color and race. In biology, we tend not to use the term race, because often one's race is determined by society based upon their skin color. But we know that a person's race is so much more complicated than just the color of their skin. And even at the genetic level, we know that all of these different factors that might be used to determine race are so much deeper than just one's skin color. And remember, just that one characteristic of skin color is only determined by a few genes. And remember, at the beginning of the semester, I said any two humans on Earth, anywhere on Earth, are roughly 99.9% similar at the genetic level. Considering this, you could see two people who had fairly dark pigmentation to their skin, and then two people who had light pigmentation to their skin. There's no reason at all to think that the two people with darker pigmentation are more similar than the two people with lighter pigmentation. And that's why, in biology, this term falls apart. So since we don't use the term race, it is better to use the term ancestry. And to kind of bring this together here, there was a study done, I would say it was probably 10, 15 years ago, where they took 100 individuals and they tested their genetics. That is, they sequenced certain genes. And we know that there are some genes that we can trace back more to an African ancestry, or we can trace it back more to a European, an Asian, a Native American ancestry. When the test came back, the students were somewhat surprised. At least some of the students were. There were some students who had classified themselves as being of African ancestry or of being European ancestry, purely based upon the color of their skin. But at the genetic level, it was wrong. Some students who had darker pigmentation actually had more genes linked to a European ancestry. And some individuals who had lighter skin color had more of a link to African ancestry. Now, one thing I'd like to close on this section is that when we identify someone's race based upon the color of their skin, as opposed to all the other characteristics that ultimately define what sociologists would call a race, when we only use that one characteristic, it can have some negative consequences. And I'll let you think about this on your own, and maybe we'll come back to it in class during an activity or an exam. What might be some medical health consequences to determining race on the single characteristic of skin color? This one, I want you to think about how this could actually have a negative impact on someone's health or how they might be medically treated. Okay, that ends this first podcast on multifactorial traits. In the next podcast, we're going to talk about methods we use to investigate multifactorial traits, the different kinds of studies we can do, and some different terms that are important to consider as we move forward. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to contact me. If not, I'll see you on the next podcast. Bye for now.